A landmark lawsuit just changed everything for gun owners across America. The Department of Justice has filed directly against state magazine bans, and the legal earthquake this creates will ripple through every corner of the country. If you own a firearm with a standard capacity magazine, what is happening right now could determine whether your property stays legal or becomes contraband. This is not hypothetical. This is not theoretical. This is happening, and the consequences will arrive faster than most people realize. Most gun owners have heard about magazine bans in various states. Some states passed laws restricting magazines above a certain round count. Owners in those states were told to surrender their magazines, modify them, or become criminals overnight. Millions of people complied. They turned in property they legally purchased. They destroyed equipment worth hundreds of dollars. They followed the law because they believed they had no choice. But what if that belief was built on a foundation that is now being challenged at the highest level of the federal government? That is exactly what is happening with this lawsuit, and it is shaking everything we thought we knew about gun rights in America. Here is what makes this situation so urgent. When states passed magazine bans, they assumed those restrictions would hold up legally. Lawmakers, prosecutors, and police treated standard capacity magazines as if they were inherently more dangerous than smaller ones. They created a system where owning the same firearm with a 10-round magazine was legal, but owning it with a 15-round magazine was a felony. That legal distinction is now under direct attack by the Justice Department itself, which means the entire premise of those state bans is being questioned in a court of law. But you need to understand something critical here. This lawsuit is not just about legal theory. It has real, immediate consequences for real people who made real decisions based on incomplete information. Thousands of gun owners in states with magazine bans were told to get rid of their magazines. They threw away property they had every right to own under federal constitutional standards. They surrendered equipment they purchased legally and destroyed things they owned outright. And now the federal government itself is saying those state bans may be unconstitutional. If you are one of those people, you might have destroyed something you were legally entitled to keep, and you might not even know that the legal ground has shifted completely beneath your feet. The dangerous part is that most people who complied with magazine bans have no idea this lawsuit exists. They follow the news casually, but do not realize that the very foundation of the bans they followed is being dismantled by the DOJ itself. This creates a dangerous window of confusion, where ordinary people make compliance decisions based on laws that may not even be valid. People think the law is settled. They think the ban is the law. But the law is not settled at all. It is being actively challenged by the federal government, and that changes everything about the risk landscape for millions of people. Let me explain exactly what is happening so you understand the stakes clearly. The DOJ has filed suit against states that enacted magazine restrictions, arguing that these restrictions violate the Second Amendment rights of ordinary citizens. This is a major shift because the federal government, which typically enforces existing laws, is now actively challenging those laws as unconstitutional. Think about what that means. The same government that is supposed to uphold the law is telling courts that certain state laws violate the Constitution. That is not a minor detail. That is a fundamental challenge to the legal basis for every magazine ban currently on the books. What happens next in this legal process will shape whether those bans remain enforceable, whether they are struck down entirely, or whether they enter a gray zone where nobody knows for certain what is legal and what is not. Each of these outcomes has massive implications for gun owners, and the uncertainty itself is dangerous. In legal gray zones, ordinary people are the ones who suffer. They make decisions based on what they think the law says, and when the law is unclear, they often make mistakes that lead to criminal charges, civil penalties, or loss of property. If you have been following this issue even casually, you have heard arguments about so-called assault weapon bans and high-capacity magazine restrictions. The people who support these bans argue that large-capacity magazines make mass shootings more deadly. They argue that limiting magazine size saves lives. Those are policy arguments that reasonable people can debate. But the legal argument is separate and far more important. The legal question is whether the government can ban common magazines that have been in widespread legal use for over a century. That question is now before the courts, and the DOJ has essentially taken the side of gun owners in this fight. You might be wondering why this matters so much right now if the lawsuit is still in progress. It matters because of the gap between what is happening legally and what people believe is settled. In states with magazine bans, law enforcement officers are still enforcing those bans. Police are still charging people who possess restricted magazines. Courts are still convicting people, but the legal foundation for those convictions is crumbling. The DOJ, the top law enforcement agency in the country, is actively arguing that those convictions may be based on unconstitutional laws. If you are facing charges right now for owning a standard capacity magazine in a state with a ban, this lawsuit could be the most important legal development in your entire situation. Here is what nobody is telling you clearly enough. The people who most need this information are the ones who followed the law and got rid of their magazines. They did what the state told them to do. They complied. They surrendered property. They modified their firearms. And they did it because they believed they had no legal alternative. But the DOJ is now saying they had legal alternatives all along. The state law they followed may have been unconstitutional from the day it was enacted. That means the people who complied were not following a valid law. They were following a law that the federal government itself believes violates their constitutional rights. This is where people go wrong. They assume that because a law is on the books and because police enforce it, it must be constitutional and settled. That assumption is dangerous in any area of law, but it is especially dangerous in the area of gun rights, where courts have been rapidly changing their interpretations of the Second Amendment over the past several years. Landmark decisions have overturned assumptions that were considered settled for decades. Magazine bans that were once considered safe from constitutional challenge are now being challenged by the highest levels of government. The legal ground is shifting, and ordinary people are getting caught in the earthquake. The question you need to ask yourself right now is simple. What would you do if you learned that the property you surrendered, destroyed, or modified under state mandate could have been legally protected under federal constitutional standards? Would you want to know that information? Would you want to understand whether you have any legal recourse or whether the window for action has already closed? That question is not hypothetical. It is the exact question thousands of gun owners are now facing as this lawsuit moves forward. And most of them do not even know the question exists. Let me give you a realistic example of how this plays out in everyday life. Imagine a person in a state with a 10-round magazine limit. They own a firearm that originally came with a 15-round magazine. They follow the law and either modify the magazine to hold 10 rounds or replace it with a 10-round magazine. They do this because they believe they are required to by law. Years later, they learn that the DOJ has filed a lawsuit arguing that the 10-round limit is unconstitutional. Suddenly, they realize they may have destroyed or modified property that they had a constitutional right to keep. They cannot go back in time. The property is gone. The modification is done, and they have no legal recourse because they did not know at the time what they know now. That is not a rare scenario. That is exactly what is happening to people right now. Some people will hear this and think it does not apply to them because they do not live in a state with a magazine ban. That is a dangerous assumption for several reasons. First, the legal precedent set by this lawsuit will affect all gun owners in all states, not just those in banned states. If the DOJ succeeds in having magazine bans declared unconstitutional, that ruling will influence how courts in every state view magazine restrictions. Second, other states may pass new magazine bans based on the assumption that such bans are constitutional. If those bans are later struck down, people who complied with them will face the same tragic situation. Third, magazine bans are just one front in a larger legal battle over the Second Amendment. Understanding how this particular battle plays out gives you insight into the broader war over your rights. The deeper truth here is that the relationship between state gun laws and federal constitutional rights is far more complicated than most people realize. States pass laws assuming they have broad authority to regulate firearms. Courts have historically allowed those regulations to stand, but recent legal developments have dramatically changed the landscape. The Supreme Court has issued decisions that strengthen Second Amendment protections. Lower courts have begun striking down regulations that were considered settled for decades. And now the DOJ itself is joining the fight on the side of gun owners. This combination creates an environment where laws that seemed permanent and unchallengeable are suddenly vulnerable. For ordinary gun owners, this environment creates both opportunity and danger. The opportunity is that your rights may be more protected than you realized. The danger is that you might make decisions based on outdated information, comply with laws that are about to be struck down, or fail to understand the legal landscape well enough to protect yourself and your family. Most people fall into the second category. They do not follow legal developments closely enough to know when the ground is shifting beneath them. This is why understanding this lawsuit is not optional. It is essential. It is the difference between making informed decisions and making costly mistakes. What the DOJ is essentially saying is that states do not have unlimited authority to restrict common firearm magazines. The government is arguing that magazine capacity limits that have been in place for years may actually violate the constitutional rights of ordinary citizens. If that argument succeeds, it will be one of the most significant developments in gun rights law in modern American history. The critical question now is what happens to people who already complied with these bans. Some legal experts believe that individuals who surrendered magazines may be able to seek compensation or restoration of their property rights. Others believe that the legal remedy will only apply going forward, not retroactively. This distinction matters enormously. If you destroyed a collection of magazines based on a law that is now being challenged as unconstitutional, you deserve to know whether you have any recourse. By the time people understand the full scope of what is happening with this lawsuit, it is often too late to act strategically. They have already made their compliance decisions. They have already modified or surrendered their property. The window for protecting themselves closed while they were following rules that the federal government now says may have been unconstitutional. This is the tragedy that plays out again and again in areas of rapidly evolving law. People follow the law as they understand it, and then the law changes, and they are left holding the consequences of decisions they made under outdated information. If you find this information valuable, make sure you are following this channel so you do not miss critical updates as this lawsuit progresses. Legal developments like this one can change quickly, and the difference between knowing and not knowing can have serious consequences for your freedom and your property. The emotional reality of this situation is that millions of gun owners have been placed in an impossible position. They were told by their state governments that certain magazines were illegal. They were threatened with criminal charges if they did not comply. They faced a choice between following the law as it was written and preserving their constitutional rights. Most people chose compliance because they did not have the resources to fight the system or the legal knowledge to understand their options. That choice may have cost them property, money, and peace of mind. And now the federal government is telling them that the very laws they complied with may have been unconstitutional all along. This is the hidden truth that nobody talks about enough. The people who followed magazine bans were not just following the law. They were surrendering constitutional rights based on laws that may not have been valid in the first place. That is not a minor technicality. That is a fundamental injustice that this lawsuit is designed to address. Whether it addresses it successfully and whether it provides any remedy for people who already complied remains to be seen. But the fact that the DOJ is taking this step at all tells you something important about how seriously the legal landscape has shifted. The stakes are real. The timeline is urgent. The legal developments are moving faster than most people realize. If you own firearms, if you live in a state with magazine restrictions, if you ever plan to move to such a state, or if you simply care about understanding how the law affects your rights, this is information you need to internalize and act upon. The days of assuming that state gun laws are settled and unchallengeable are over. The legal ground is moving, and the movement is happening at the highest levels of government. Stay informed. Stay alert. And most importantly, do not make compliance decisions based on assumptions that may no longer be valid. The lawsuit is moving forward. The courts are hearing arguments, and the outcome will shape the legal landscape for gun owners across the country for years to come. If this video helped you understand something important, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this information. Subscribe so you do not miss the next update on this rapidly developing situation. And keep watching because there is more to come and you will not want to miss it. The bottom line is simple. The DOJ has challenged state magazine bans at the highest level. That challenge has serious implications for every gun owner in every state. Understand what is happening. Protect yourself and your family. And do not let this critical moment pass you by without taking it seriously. This story is just beginning to unfold, and the next chapter will matter more than the first.